Bên cho sách.
It's my great pleasure for me and to meet you in college today. And on behalf of myself and my colleague, I would like to express our sincere gratitude for taking the time with us and share your valuable experience and expertise in the field of law at sea. I believe you may already be aware. Yesterday, my Prime Minister, Samdech Mahabawar Thapday Honmanet, officially announced Cambodia's decision to initiate the compulsory conciliation process under the UNCLOS. This process aims to achieve a peaceful solution of the overlapping maritime claim between Cambodia and Thailand. Given your extensive experience and expertise in the law of the sea, we are very grateful for the opportunity to learn from your insight and practice experience. We look forward to hearing and your reflection on the compulsory conciliation process, including the challenge, opportunity, and lesson learned. But I also would like to introduce my colleague here. Maybe he will introduce by themselves.
My name is Sok Supira. I'm the Director of Department of Border Affairs. Nice to meet you, Professor, again. I used to attend the training course in Singapore.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
2024.
My name is Pandit. I'm currently working with my boss right here, having border affairs, and we're currently working on the Cambodia-Thailand borders for the country.
And my name is Porn. I have just recently been accepted into the graduate certificate of maritime studies.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for coming and thank for your initiative to brief us the UNCLOS affairs. And my name is Duan Chinese. I'm from Department of Legal and Treaty Affairs. So sorry for my director. He was abroad now, so he cannot join us. And hopefully we can discuss more about UNCLOS later. Okay.
Greeting, Professor and Madam. I'm also pleased to meet you, and I'm also from the Department of Legal and Treaty Affairs.
Good afternoon. This is Richard. I'm the Deputy Chief of Bureau of Cambodia-Thailand Borders Affairs. And nice to meet you again, Professor.
Well, look, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be able to come and talk to you about law of the sea matters. I know this is an exciting time in the law of the sea for Cambodia. It's been a big year already, and the year is only half over. But I think I want to extend my sincere congratulations for Cambodia's ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention. I think it's a wonderful step, a very positive step, and follows on from your ratification of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement a few years ago. So I think these are very positive times. And look, whatever I can do in relation to talking about Law of the Sea issues, I'm very happy to do. I've spent my life working in this area, and I know it's very important to states to maximise what they are able to from the Convention. The Convention has much in it that is of benefit to states, particularly for developing states. It was drafted very much by a large group of states who wanted to maximise what they could get, particularly to overturn vestiges of colonialism that were not long past at the time the Convention was negotiated. And so there's much in the Convention that's very useful and very helpful. And so I think it's wonderful that Cambodia has embraced the Convention, and very happy to talk about issues that can assist Cambodia ensure that it can fulfil all the benefits that the Convention can bring. And it looks as if you don't need as much help from me in that respect, given you're proceeding to initiate only the second compulsory conciliation in the history of the Convention to help you resolve your long-standing maritime boundary issues with Thailand in the Gulf. Certainly Australia had a long experience with this, with a process that was initiated by Timor-Leste. Yeah. That process began in difficult circumstances but ended very well. And I would hope that Cambodia enjoys a similar experience, that the process can lead to a long-lasting and robust solution for what has been a difficult boundary issue. I first had the opportunity to visit Cambodia in 1997 as part of a workshop looking at joint development arrangements, and that was sponsored by the Canadian government at that time. I had studied for my PhD in Canada, and so the Canadians invited me because Australia had experience with Indonesia with joint development arrangements. And I know that the principal concerns then were with respect to your boundaries in the Gulf and the issues with Thailand. So I know that it's been a very long-standing issue, and one which I hope that this mechanism helps you reach a resolution with respect to the boundary, because I think it's one that I'm sure both states would like to be settled and not be a source of discord between. I'm very happy to talk about particular issues in that regard. I can talk about the conciliation process and Australia's experience of it if you wish. Yeah?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Well,
Please proceed.
yeah. Well, look, it's fair to say that Australia and Timor-Leste had difficult times with their maritime boundary, and the length of time that boundary was an issue was also many decades.
Yes.
Various mechanisms were tried to negotiate the boundary. These didn't lead anywhere, and ultimately relations became difficult between Australia and Timor-Leste in a way that should never have been the case. Ultimately, Timor-Leste initiated the dispute, the compulsory conciliation, because Australia had put in an exception to compulsory jurisdiction for boundary delimitation, in the same way as Thailand has a similar clause where it's exempted boundary delimitation. But that exemption comes with a rider that the other side must accept compulsory conciliation. And so Timor-Leste said to Australia, right, well, you now have to accept compulsory conciliation, and you've done the same thing to Thailand for exactly the same reason, because Australia has a clause that exempts boundary delimitation. They're not uncommon clauses, quite a number of them. The process itself, though, is very different to traditional dispute resolution, extraordinarily different. I know Cambodia has had historical experience of the International Court of Justice and had some success in that regard, but it's not like a court case, and it shouldn't be thought of as running like a court case at all. The experience with the conciliation was that the conciliators saw themselves as mediators with a very wide brief to try to bring the parties together to find common ground to help facilitate negotiations. And very much the experience with Australia and Timor-Leste was of this nature. So the conciliators, for example, always formed a common group. They never divided internally between the two who were selected by Australia and the two who were selected by Timor-Leste, and the additional appointment of the fifth conciliator. They functioned as a group. And unlike judges who would only ever hear submissions that would be given to both sides and be open to both sides, the conciliation commissioners visited Dili, they visited Canberra, they had confidential meetings with both sides in an effort to try to identify what each side wanted, what they felt their needs were, what they felt their what they wanted to get from the whole process, and issues that they felt were important and were difficult between them. And this led the Commission to then take that information, never sharing it with the other side, but to produce what the Commissioners described as non-papers. And these non-papers were designed to explore where there was profitable room for negotiation between the parties. And so, in effect, Australia told the Commissioners what it wanted and what it felt was important. Timor-Leste did the same, and then the Commission has taken these two confidential briefings and blended them into a paper to say, here's an area where you might wish to explore this. In addition, because there was a lack of trust between the two parties, the Commissioners made suggestions to both about matters that they could extend a gesture to the other side. So for Timor-Leste had run a number of arbitrations that were not about boundary delimitation because they couldn't bring one. So they brought arbitrations about procedural matters in an effort to try to pressure Australia into changing its position. This was not successful. Whereas Australia was in the throes of licensing new seabed blocks for petroleum exploration right up against where the boundary arrangements were. And so the Conciliation Commissioners said, Timor-Leste, we would think it was a good thing for you to drop your additional arbitrations. In Australia, we think it would be a good idea for you to drop these boundary block auctions. And you do this for the other to demonstrate that you are interested and willing to proceed. Now, both sides did this, and that was designed, as the Commissioners reported, to be a trust-building exercise, so negotiations could be more fruitful down the track. Once they had agreed to do this, they then began to listen to both sides again about what key issues were and identify further, with greater precision, what these issues would be. Again, in one of these non-papers. Things that weren't designed to be a report of the Commission, but the Commissioners' views on what both sides were after. Now, ultimately, the Commission was able to identify what it felt was the key source of disagreement between the two parties, that everything else stemmed from this one key issue. And in this case, the issue was about the possibility of a pipeline running from an area of a large gas field that was principally through earlier arrangements under Timorese, it was under joint control, but principally for the benefit of the Timorese. About 80% of its value to Timor and remaining 20% to Australia. Source of contention was the Timorese wanted a pipeline from this gas field to run to Timor, and Australia didn't think that was a good idea, principally because between the gas field and the island of Timor was very deep water, about 1,500 to 2,000 metres deep. When placed to the two parties, Australia said, well, look, we don't really care where the pipeline goes. We want the gas field to be economic because we want Timor-Leste to have money to be able to develop. We want a happy, stable Timor-Leste that is not under financial strain. And the Timorese said, well, we really want this pipeline. We think it's very important. And so very quickly, the commissioners realised that there really wasn't a dispute here, that Australia wasn't interested in the pipeline. Australia wanted an economic East Timor. And so at that point, they said, well, Australia, we don't need you anymore.
Right.
If you don't care where the pipeline goes, what we need to do is talk to the petroleum companies. And so, uniquely, from an international law perspective, they invited the joint venture partners who had the rights to the gas field and invited them into the conciliation. So they were engaged. And very quickly, Australia backed off and said, well, great, we're happy. If Timor-Leste is happy and they will be able to exploit the field, this can be resolved. And so very quickly, Australia and Timor-Leste were able to conclude a maritime boundary, a permanent boundary, that settled these matters. And it was left to Timor-Leste and the petroleum companies to determine whether or not they would build a pipeline. Now, interestingly enough, they still are arguing about where the pipeline should go. But Australia and Timor-Leste have a boundary, and that boundary is resolved. And relations between the two states, which had been poor, have been restored. Now, is this a useful model for resolving your dispute? Well, it depends on factors which I don't know. Ultimately, it was the fact that Australia and Timor-Leste were willing to trust each other and to work through the Commission to build trust that they were able to do this. Whether, given more difficult events that have occurred between Cambodia and Thailand, that level of trust can be found, I honestly don't know. I would hope so, but I could understand if it would exist, because things have been difficult with the land border. Ultimately, once Australia and Timor-Leste began to trust each other, the commissioners were able to use that to steer the parties towards what they needed to resolve the dispute. And that is encouraging and potentially quite useful. But it requires a level of trust, which the commissioners will try to fulfil. But I don't know if that can be found. Australia and Timor-Leste went into this process at loggerheads. Australia really didn't want the conciliation, but once it was clear the conciliation would go ahead, the Australian government's attitude was, we will try. And that proved to be very, very helpful, because it allowed the trust building to go ahead. I don't know Thailand's attitude to your filing of the conciliation. They might think, okay, this is an opportunity, maybe we will invest in this and see if we can resolve things. Or they might react and say, no, we're not keen at all and we don't wish to. I don't know which they would do, but both are possible. Because it's a non-binding process, they may be obliged to sit through the conciliation, but they don't have to accept any outcomes or recommendations from it. And therefore, you may find that leaves you, having gone through the process, in the same position that you are now. But by the same token, if it works, your position will be much improved. So I don't think it's a poor decision. I think it's a brave decision, and I think it's potentially one that could yield tremendous benefit. But it could just as easily not work. But I don't think you would be in any worse position than the present situation. So I think it is worth trying, and potentially, if it succeeds, it's likely to lead to a whole host of conciliations taking place, because if the only two that have ever occurred have both been successful in resolving long-standing disputes, it will be a tremendous result. but it is a peculiar process.
Just a quick question back to me. For Australia and Timor-Leste region agreement, which I really want to know from the audience side, what was the public sentiment on that particular matter?
Look,
Because I understand it's tremendously important as well.
yeah, look, it's fair to say that public sentiment in Australia was mixed. The gas field itself, compared to Australia's other gas fields, is relatively remote and not very large. So from Australia, it wasn't a case of we must secure these resources or we're all in trouble. Australia's in the happy position of having lots and lots of gas and being able to export lots of gas. So this field wasn't crucial to Australia. The Australian population are also highly sympathetic to the Timorese. This has always been the case. The Timorese fought with Australians during World War II against the Japanese.
Right.
And so there are always been very positive relations between the Timorese people and Australian people. And so there was some sympathy to Timorese moves to try to recover independence during the time with Indonesia, even though Australia also has maintained very good relationship with Indonesia. By the same token, the Australian government had reached arrangements with Timor-Leste that were designed to facilitate the exploitation of the gas field and to give the bulk of the field to Timorese revenue. That made the Timorese happy initially, but then over the course of a decade, gradually they soured on it and wanted more. And so Australian people were sympathetic to the Timorese, but also a deal had been done, why would the deal be undone? And so this meant that the Australian public by and large were ambivalent or a little sympathetic, and there weren't strong views on either side. Whereas I could imagine that could be rather different with respect to this issue, particularly given other relations between Thailand and Cambodia, that this is a matter of grave national interest to everybody, and therefore it's probably more front of mind for the average Cambodian than it would have been for the average Australian at the same time.
Thank you, Professor, for your detail briefly about Australia's experience on compulsory conciliation with Timor-Leste. So, as I have learned that since Timor-Leste won the independence in 2002, so you mentioned that the issue happened since maybe many decades. As I can say, in 1953, Australia proclaimed that the maritime zero zone. So, can I know before the compulsory conciliation, do you have any issues and what the way to handle between Australia and Timor-Leste between 2002 until 2016? As first questions, and secondly, it is a hard time for Australia and Timor-Leste because 2 years of compulsory conciliation, 2016 until 2018, and finally reported issues. So thank you. And so any challenges that Australia faces with Timor-Leste, because maritime zone or overlapping zone it's not easy to discuss because it maritime limitations and yeah. And after that, from 2018, the report also provided permanent maritime limitation. So, what Australia have done next after the compulsory report? And another question also focus on you mentioned that it is a way that is non-binding obligations between two states. So, for example, Cambodian government of Thailand has claimed that they don't recognize the map of scale 100 on 20 200,000, and he used another one which he used to claim with Japan during 1940s. one scale of 1 on 500,000. So if Thai denied that one, the compulsory conciliation, what to do next for Cambodia if you're positive. And later on, I think during the commission process, during the compulsory conciliation, so you have chose the conciliator from your country, Australia, and also another from Canada.
Yes.
So it is difficult to find the presidents of the commission first. Thank you.
Yeah. Look, deal with the very last one first. Australia, it was my understanding, didn't want to pick 2 Australians for the Conciliation Commission because it was apparent that Timor-Leste was not going to pick anybody who was Timorese.
Right.
Because they didn't have anybody with the diplomatic and legal expertise that would have been useful in those circumstances. And Australia didn't want to have the Commission unbalanced in that way.
Right.
So Australia, in addition to selecting an Australian who had served as the legal counsel for INO for many years, Rosalie Balkan, went for a Canadian who was also a New Zealander, originally from New Zealand but had spent his career at the University of Ottawa, Professor John McRae. And that way it was somebody who was not Australian, who was very well respected and served in arbitrations and in other fora in a way that was perceived to be very neutral.
Okay.
And so to that, but somebody who was unimpeachable in Professor McRae, but also not somebody who would find the proceedings difficult or strange or anything else. So to that extent it was good. And Timor-Leste did much the same. They picked 2 individuals of impeccable character and so on. And then I think both sides then worked together to try to find a suitable fifth candidate, and that proved to be an inspired choice. I think Ambassador Taxo Jensen was excellent, fulfilled his role very, very well, and distinguished himself, I think, with the work that he did. So I think the ultimate success owed a lot to his endeavours. In terms of going back to Australia and Timor-Leste and how they ended up where they were, Australia had been trying to resolve issues with respect to the boundary between what was then East Timor and Australia back from the times the Portuguese were present.
Right.
Because Australia had resolved the continental shelf boundary with Indonesia in the early 1970s.
Yes.
And it wanted to close the gap between the 2. Ultimately, Indonesia went into East Timor and incorporated it into Indonesia, and Australia recognised that, as did other states in the region, relatively quickly. So by 1979, Australia recognised that East Timor was a province of Indonesia. That saw Australia and Indonesia negotiate, and it led in 1989 to the negotiation of a joint development arrangement called the Timor Gap arrangement, colloquially. And to talk about that issue was why I came to Cambodia in 1997, because the Canadians had no experience of it, and it was thought a good idea. So I got to spend some days here talking about the Timor Gap arrangement. That arrangement ended, though, in 1999 after the UN-sponsored referendum in Timor-Leste, which saw Timor-Leste break away from Indonesia and initially go under UN control. Now, Australia and the UN were very conscious early in the peace that the new territory would have no revenue. Much of its infrastructure had been destroyed in the rioting that took place after the referendum, and so Timor-Leste was in very bad shape. It had effectively looked like it had been through a war, because hundreds of thousands of people took to the street and buildings were torched, and it was all very unpleasant. So Australia and the UN entered into an agreement that Australia would share the revenue from the joint development area that had existed with Indonesia, and would share it with the United Nations for the benefit of East Timor. This is the first, and as far as I'm aware, only time the UN has ever entered into any sort of maritime boundary arrangement in its own right. And it was only ever done as a temporary arrangement to secure revenue for the territory. Before the Timorese reassumed their government, Australia entered into negotiations with the new administration, and so as soon as Timor-Leste became, I won't say became independent, they took the view they were independent in 1975, but from the moment that Timor-Leste reasserted its control over its own territory, the very first international act they did was to enter into a new boundary treaty with Australia, which retained the central area of the joint development zone and remitted 90% of the revenue to East Timor, to Timor-Leste. So instead of being the 50-50 arrangement that had existed with Indonesia, it was 90-10. This benefited both sides in that it brought more revenue to Timor-Leste, but it also meant that Timor-Leste could benefit from something that it didn't have. And that is, it had no expertise in managing offshore petroleum. Managing offshore petroleum is complicated.
Right.
You need officials who have tremendous expertise. They need to understand how the oil industry works, and they need stability, because the oil industry is all about the long term. A platform might run for 25 to 30 years. That platform will cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to put in place. And if it's going to be that expensive, it won't make any money for the oil company until the latter half of its life. Which means if there is instability, nobody will invest, because they can't be certain that when they come out the other side, that the tax arrangements, the regulations will remain the same, because all their profit is built into that stability. And if the regime is unstable, or it keeps changing its tax arrangements, it keeps changing its regulatory structures, no one will invest. And Timor-Leste, as far as the oil industry was concerned, had never run anything. And so retaining the joint development structure was useful for Timor-Leste because it allowed Australia to manage the petroleum side, the regulation and the tax revenue, which meant oil companies would invest because they knew what they were going to get, because Australia had been running offshore oil and gas for 60 years. And so in those circumstances, Timor-Leste benefited from that arrangement in 2002, which became known as the Timor Sea Treaty. Timor-Leste experienced some internal instability in 2006. There was an attempt to murder Jose Ramos Horta. He was shot. And so Timor-Leste was unstable. And in the wake of that instability, they wanted better taxation arrangements. They wanted more money.
Yeah, right.
And so they went back to Australia and said, we want more money from the arrangements, we want better arrangements, and we want to have a permanent boundary. And so Australia renegotiated the arrangements again, and it became what's known as the Certain Maritime Arrangements in the Timor Sea Treaty, or CMATs. And CMATs provided for a retention of the joint development arrangement and the division of the money, but changes with respect to some issues around unitisation of the field, and changes with respect to some of the governance arrangements to give Timor-Leste a bit more. This was fine, and Timor-Leste was happy until about another 6 or 7 years went past, and then they became increasingly unhappy. And they began to put more pressure on Australia to go and revisit the arrangements again. Now, I personally didn't think this was a very good idea, because what Timor-Leste needed to consider was there were other potential fields in their maritime jurisdiction. And the more they kept wanting to change the arrangements in the Timor Sea with Australia, the more they were signalling oil companies that they were not stable, that they would not provide the stability that those companies require to be able to do the long-term investment that they wanted to do. So Timor-Leste was not helping its own case to attract more oil and gas by behaving in a way to say, right, we've got this, we agree, and then 7 years later, no, we want more. And then 7 years later, we want more again. This can't be a way to make anyone who has to invest for 30 years feel comfortable. So Timor-Leste, when Australia said, well, we're not going to move anymore because we can't have this instability, we made a deal with you, this is it, then put on pressure that ultimately led to the conciliation. And it's fair to say Australia didn't want the conciliation, they didn't think it was a good idea. But once the conciliators found that they had jurisdiction for the conciliation to take place, the Australian government said, well, if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. And in hindsight, that proved to be a wonderful decision because it led to the conclusion of a boundary. What is particularly noticeable, though, in that new boundary arrangement is that there is still a retention for joint development, even though it settles the boundary completely. And the reason there is still joint development there is the same reason it existed in the first place, and that is to give Timor-Leste stability to impress oil companies. Australia will be involved in the management of the field, and that the taxation arrangements are stable. To give Timor-Leste the credibility to be able to attract petroleum investment. Now, states have done this in other circumstances. The joint development arrangements between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are a good example of this, where Bahrain at the time their arrangements were entered into had no expertise in managing a field, and they needed Saudi expertise to do it, so they agreed that the Saudis would run the field and they would get half the revenue. And so the arrangements with Timor-Leste echo back to that old arrangement because the Timorese need expertise to be able to make it go, to actually get it to work. And that's proven to be also quite interesting. That what the Timorese wanted was a permanent boundary, but they could never give up the joint arrangement because if they did, no one would want to invest, and they'd be in all sorts of strife. Now,
That wouldn't be in our interest either.
No. Now, I'm at a loss to remember your other questions after all of that, and I don't want to...
I scribbled them down. So you talked about the selection of conciliators, you talked about the other events in between the different periods, and then...
What took place after the compulsory conciliation report?
Right.
Well, look, to be honest, just before the report was finally tabled, Australia and Timor-Leste entered into a boundary treaty, which was then signed and ultimately very quickly ratified soon after. It meant the Conciliation Commission had to be given special authorisation to continue because the amount of time it took to get all that sorted meant that more than 12 months had passed. And the Law of the Sea Convention mandates 12 months to the final report. And because the Commission wanted to report after the boundary treaty had been agreed, it had to wait until the boundary treaty was finally sorted out, and that took an extra 6 weeks. So Australia and Timor-Leste agreed to extend the Commission for a further 6 weeks. And that sets a precedent that if you're close to the Commission being successful, you can extend it beyond 12 months if both sides agree. Nobody objected to that, and I think it was more a case the Commission wanted to celebrate its success, and so it wanted to wait until after that had been done. The boundary arrangement since has been quite robust. Australia and Timor-Leste have been getting on very well. As I said, it hasn't helped the oil companies in Timor-Leste reach agreement about where the pipeline ought to go from the gas field, but that's because it's a commercial decision, not a decision between Australia and Timor-Leste. Australia has no view with respect to where the pipeline should go and doesn't really care at this point. It just happens now as a boundary with Timor-Leste. So Timor-Leste is still negotiating with the joint venture partners to try to settle where the pipeline will go. Australia has, however, moved on with Timor-Leste with respect to boundary arrangements. So there's good agreement with respect to things like search and rescue response and cooperation in oil spill preparedness and occasional joint patrols and so forth. And Australia has provided Timor-Leste with a patrol vessel as part of the broader Pacific Patrol Boat scheme, which Timor-Leste was not a party of because when it first happened, because that was during the time Indonesia was in situ. So Australia and Timor-Leste now cooperate very well with respect to maritime areas. The boundary treaty envisages some alteration is still possible, but that is to incorporate where the Timorese Indonesian maritime boundaries will go to set up a tri-point between the three states. That has been a way off for a long time, but ultimately Timor-Leste and Indonesia are reported to be in negotiations with respect to their maritime boundaries now, and that their preceding land issues that they wanted to settle appear to have been settled, although no formal agreement has emerged, at least not publicly. But their maritime boundary agreement, I think they've had 3 sets of negotiations, and another is scheduled to come up in August. So they are proceeding enthusiastically. When they do, they will engage with Australia as to where the tri-points are, and that may necessitate some minor alteration to the agreement that Australia concluded under the auspices with the Conciliation Commission. So even if the Commission is successful, 2 states are never in isolation. There's always going to be a third one floating around somewhere. In your case, there are the Vietnamese next door. And so even if a boundary is to be concluded, you need to sort out where the tri-point will be, and that takes 3 states to do that, not 2. So any agreement needs to take into account that tri-point at some point. But usually it's relatively minor. It's an adjustment of maybe 30 or 40 square nautical miles of seabed, which sounds a lot, but in seabed terms is nothing, very, very small. So to that extent, that's there. Is that a lot?
Did that answer all your questions, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have 2 questions. I'm not so long.
I encourage you to make the rest of the
My
presentation.
questions are related to political and technical perspective.
Yeah.
Based on your experience, especially the Australian government, did the Australian government plan to the National Assembly before or after starting compulsory consideration at the time? And after the decision of the compulsory consideration was issued, how did the Australian government explain to the public opinion or the opposition party? How did the Australian government deal with the opposition party? And one more question is related to the technical aspect. Geographically, Cambodia and Thailand are the adjacent states, not like Australia and Timor-Leste. They are the opposite states. Yes. Based on your study, what are the difference between Cambodia and Thailand and Timor and Australia about initiative compulsory consideration? Yes, because we are at different locations, not like Australia and Timor, because Thailand and Cambodia are the adjacent states. And one question about the diplomacy.
I'm writing as fast as I can.
That's okay. All good.
And how did the Australian government at the time deal with Timor-Leste government about the diplomatic relation? When 2 countries initiated the case to one or another arena about the deciding the case, normally they are confronting in the perspective of diplomacy. How do you deal with this essential process?
Well, to deal with your first question, Australia constitutionally owes our structures to the British. We follow a British model.
Yes.
And so our constitution and policy in terms of foreign governments was set in London. Now, Australian independence is a very slow process through the First World War and then the Second World War. So by the time the Second World War is concluded, Australia is functionally independent and maintains diplomatic relations with others. But our Constitution says nothing about any of this, because it dates from the time when we were part of the Empire. So for Australia to enter into a treaty, there is no constitutional basis to do so. And so this is a matter for our executive. So the executive would be our cabinet, so the ministers led by the Prime Minister, and they make decisions, and among the decisions they can make is for Australia to enter into a treaty. Now, this doesn't have any domestic implications unless and until the Australian Parliament passes legislation to implement the treaty. So the fact that Australia is a party to all sorts of international agreements has no effect on citizens in Australia unless and until the Parliament passes legislation to give effect to that treaty. So when Australia could deal with Timor-Leste, it did not need to engage with the Parliament to do so, because ultimately this was a matter that could be concluded by the executive. However, we've in the last 20 odd years instituted a system within the Parliament that before Australia takes final steps to ratify a treaty, there will be a parliamentary...
My least favourite thing, sorry.
Australia will, within the Australian Parliament, there will be a parliamentary inquiry into any treaty action Australia takes with respect to ratification. And this allows members of the public and members of Parliament to ask questions of officials: why are you doing this? What will the... And a document called a national interest analysis has to be prepared, and this outlines why Australia is doing what it's doing. So,
I should say, from a perspective of a member of the Australian public, this is a key, important part of our democracy, and I value it very much. But as a public servant, as a bureaucrat who has to write these documents and then explain it to them, it's a lot of work, but it's very important.
So what it meant was Australia could engage with Timor-Leste and the conciliation process without any reference to Parliament. But to ultimately ratify and to implement arrangements, the Parliament had to be engaged. But this was after most of the work was done. And because constitutionally that was the way things could be done. It's also fair to say that while this had not been a big issue in terms of the Australian public, it was also not a huge issue politically. And so our principal government and the principal opposition parties had no strong view about these arrangements other than a strong desire to have good relations with Timor-Leste. And so once Timor-Leste and Australia had embraced an agreement, in Australia we would say this has bipartisan support. Both the government and the principal opposition parties said, yes, we're very happy with this. And so to the extent the Australian people engaged with it at all, everyone was very comfortable with it. It was seen, this is good, we don't have poor relations with Timor-Leste, now everybody is happy and we all move forward. And so the issue never attracted huge public happiness or huge public anger. People were delighted that things had been resolved and everyone moved on. So when the legislation that was necessary to implement these arrangements had to be passed, it was a non-event. It happened and there was very little fuss about it. And the parliamentary inquiry into the ratification also was not controversial at all. It was done relatively quickly, and there was, I think, a unanimous report saying how wonderful it was that this had all happened.
Great use of international law.
Yeah, so it was not something that caused any difficulties in the aftermath, but our political system and our constitutional arrangements meant it was easy for Australia to advance this and to let it mature quite substantially before any parliamentary scrutiny and engagement with the process was necessary, by which stage it was clear that both sides were happy, and that made everybody happy. So it didn't cause too much in relation to trouble.
Difference between like the geographic location.
Yes, quite. The opposite and adjacent states. Look, Australia is not an adjacent state with anybody in this part of the world at all. We haven't been for some time, although before Papua New Guinea's independence in 1975, we were an adjacent state with Indonesia, and concluded a maritime boundary with Indonesia to that effect in south of the big island of New Guinea, which was subsequently adopted by Papua New Guinea when it became independent. So for Australia and Timor-Leste, it was a big area between the two, and the issue that had become complicated related to the underwater geography of the region. That Australia had been able to convince Indonesia to make use of a large submarine feature called the Timor Trough as the basis for the continental shelf boundary between the two states. They did so largely because Australia and Indonesia had concluded their maritime boundaries in the wake of the International Court of Justice's decision in the North Sea continental shelf cases. And that decision had stressed that underwater features could be significant in the conclusion of continental shelf boundaries. Now, it is fair to say that no decision since that one has ever said that since. But Indonesia's timing was lousy, and they agreed to a boundary based on a submarine feature, which, had they done so today, they wouldn't have agreed to. They wouldn't have agreed at all. Timor-Leste was in the fortunate position that by the time they began to negotiate with Australia, it was clear that the North Sea continental shelf cases were not where the law had gone. And so Timor-Leste had a much stronger position to assert. From Australia's perspective, the starting point was to say, well, we still want the boundary continuing along the trough. But the Australian government, I think, ultimately realised, and I don't speak for the Australian government, I'm an academic, but they ultimately realised that this was not going to win, that they were not going to be able to use the submarine feature, which is partly why Australia would not have wanted to go to court, because that would not be forthcoming. Ultimately, Australia and Timor-Leste had to reach arrangements because the boundary with Indonesia wasn't going to move. And there were oil and gas fields to the east and to the west of the gap area that pertained to Timor-Leste. And one of those fields overlapped with the Australian and Timorese area. So they needed to work together, and they had to work together. And to that extent, it's interesting to note that the area of overlap is an area that isn't from opposite states. It's the east-west line that the Timorese have to have between the Australian shelf on each side and the Timorese shelf, which comes down like a fist extending southward. So to that extent, these lateral boundaries resemble more closely adjacent boundaries than they do opposite. So to some extent, the Australian and Timorese situation, whilst it is between two opposite states, has some features that look like adjacent states. And to some extent, the same is almost true for you, because although you have an adjacent portion of the boundary where your land boundaries meet, much of the maritime boundary is also generated by you effectively being an opposite state to Thailand across the Gulf. And therefore, much of the boundary behaves like a boundary between opposite states, not adjacent states. And I'm sure you could use various methodologies to calculate where a boundary could go and work out which areas of coast were generating that methodology. And I think you would probably find that at least half, if not more, of the boundary was being generated by coasts that were opposite each other rather than coasts that were adjacent, because of the configuration of the Gulf. And so to that extent, some of what you have to deal with is also not dissimilar to the situation between Australia and Timor-Leste, but is also distinct. Does it mean that there are lessons to be learned? Well, ultimately Australia and Timor-Leste reached agreement because they wanted to sort things out. They were willing to trust each other, and it was also clear what the principles of maritime boundary delimitation were by that stage. Since the Black Sea case between Ukraine and Romania, the methodology for the delimitation of maritime boundaries has been clear. The three-step process that the ICJ outlined has been used in every case, with one exception, in the years since the Black Sea case. And that one exception is the boundary between Nicaragua and Honduras. And the only reason it's an exception is because of the very peculiar coastal formation that exists between the two at the mouth of the Coco River. And it's not a rejection of the three-step process, it's saying we just can't get it to work here because of the peculiar geography. So in the best part of a dozen other cases, the methodology is clear. This meant that when Australia and Timor-Leste had to settle where the boundary was going to go, and it reached a point where they were willing to agree it was clear what the principles of international law said about where the boundary would go. Now, you are also in the position where those principles are clear now, and in some respects, some of those principles are quite useful in your favour. I know that one of the issues that's existed between you and Thailand are the status of Ko Kra and Ko Lo Sin. Ko Lo Sin particularly is very, very small. There are a number of international cases which have dealt with features that are not as are bigger than Ko Lo Sin and have seen the effect of those reduced. So to that extent, international law gives you a good tool to assist in negotiation. And you don't have to look very far. And attending the Maritime Boundaries workshop as you did in Singapore, you've already heard all this before. And it's been discussed at some length, the status of islands and the use of that three-step process. I know because I go there too. So to that extent, there are tools which international law can help you with in this, and these are matters which both sides can seek to discuss in the context of the Conciliation Commission. To say to the commissioners, look, these are issues we think are important. These are issues which we think international law tells a story that is relevant to how a boundary ought to be concluded here. And that's something that you can do. It's something that Thailand can do as well. They can make use of the cases as well. So to that extent, you both have tools at your disposal that can be relevant to the Commission, for the Commission to think where is common ground, how can we take this forward? And that's true for opposite states, it's true for adjacent states. And I think the key here is to go back to the case law, to go back to what the ICJ, arbitral tribunals, International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, what they all had to say about principles of boundary delimitation and how a boundary ought to be constructed. Because a commission is going to be aware of that material and is more likely to be persuaded by arguments by one side that draw from that material than another side saying, we deserve this, we want it. Right. Which is not going to be persuasive. And then the Commission will recommend what it thinks and encourage discussions. So I urge you to make use of the law, because I think that's where you can best advance your efforts to persuade the Commission of the strength of your arguments.
Thank you for your sorrowful explanation.
We spent most of the time talking about the specific aspect of UNCLOS. I know that's absolutely and fairly front of all of your minds at the moment, but I thought in just a couple of remaining minutes we might have questions on other aspects relating to UNCLOS, on implementation, things that you might be thinking about with other ministries, for example, or challenges that you see in that space.
No worry, I have two more questions.
Okay, great.
In order to kill the time, so I just ask your perspective on the way that we have the compulsory conciliation with Thailand. Since I can talk briefly about the any treaty with Thailand. So before we have 1904 and 1907 treaty with Thailand, and later on in 1940, Thailand have new electoral maps for themselves and go to Japan during the occupation of Japan in Asia. And then after that, after the colonization in 1945, so Thailand come back and agree to use the 1904 and 1907. So in this way, until now, Thailand declared to expel or recognize the boundary maps of France during the colonization. So what is your perspective for the conciliations if Thailand still trying to escape from the table? And currently, they're just trying to say that, or they want to have negotiation, not compulsory conciliation. So this is the questions. And second one, I have found that Australia has a very good negotiation, also agreement between Australia and that country with maritime boundaries, so especially with Indonesia. For example, you have agreement in 1997 with Indonesia, and then until 2025 upgrade to a treaty of common security. And just want to ask for your like a long-term solution for Cambodia and Thailand. So what is the suggestion for the permanent boundary agreements?
Look, Australia is in the fortunate position of being able to conclude most of its boundaries with its neighbours, and some of those boundary areas are quite complicated. The boundary arrangements we have with Papua New Guinea are arguably the most complicated boundary arrangements on the planet.
Okay.
The treaty itself runs for hundreds of pages and delimits areas of territorial sea to within 1 square metre of accuracy.
Right.
It's ridiculously complicated and detailed, but it was necessary because that was what was needed to settle the boundary. And then it's been stuck to very strongly ever since. The same is true for the arrangements with Indonesia. Australia has arrangements which are peculiar, that to have Australian seabed overlain by Indonesian water column.
Right.
The Law of the Sea Convention didn't envisage this. It's possible to do it. It doesn't breach the convention, but it's complicated. And that has required Australia and Indonesia not only to have multiple treaties to provide for this, but also to have a series of memoranda of understanding which deal with the operational necessity that comes out of all of this. So, well, how do we respond to pollution? How do we deal with marine scientific research? How do we deal with search and rescue matters? How do we deal with environmental approvals and so on? And so Australia and Indonesia had to work all of these things out. And one of the good things was that once you work them out, it puts a lot of officials in close contact with each other on a very regular basis. And this builds up trust because everybody has to work towards the same end to get these arrangements to work. The relevant ministers have agreed to this, so the public servants are right, we now have to do it. The minister has told us we have no choice. And everybody makes it work. And then over time, that builds up a cadre of people who understand each other, who work together, and it becomes second nature. And then trust is built. Australia's current ambassador to the Netherlands was involved in these processes, and his favourite saying about all of this is good fences make good neighbours.
Right.
That a good boundary treaty that requires regular consultation and working together builds up trust, which in turn makes the neighbourhood better, makes the neighbourhood safer. And so it's a way to bring everybody together. This is why I was pleased to hear that Indonesia and Vietnam had agreed to similar bifurcated boundary arrangements in the waters between them, where I think it'll end up being Indonesian seabed and Vietnamese water column over the top of it. That they've announced this, they haven't released the coordinates, but they've had to negotiate a similar set of memoranda of understanding. And it will compel them to cooperate. It will make them work together because they have to get it to go. So it'll either be a disaster where they hate each other, or they will work together and things will be better. So to that extent, if you can get something that will work and it requires regular engagement, it will improve relations, simply because the two governments will be obliged to engage with each other on a daily basis over small things, and that will in turn create stability and help rationalise how things go. Another one?
You mentioned something about Indonesian Common Security Treaty.
Oh, right. Yeah, look, Australia has had lots of arrangements with Indonesia over time. not least of which because we have the longest maritime boundary between our two states in the world. We used to have slightly less originally than between Denmark and Canada.
Canada, yeah.
But Indonesia has proclaimed some areas of continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles that abut the Australian exclusive economic zone, which makes our effective boundary now longer. So we have the longest maritime boundary of the two states. And it's necessary for the two states to work on this, and it's built up trust over time. Australia and Indonesia in the past have had difficult relations from time to time, never acrimonious, never attacking each other, but things were difficult in the wake of the Timorese referendum. Indonesia was very cranky with Australia. It felt Australia had played some part in the referendum, which I don't think it happened, but Indonesia wasn't happy about it. But today, I think it's fair to say the relations are very, very good. And part of the reason are all the boundary arrangements and an understanding that Australia and Indonesia need to work together to make them go. And this has improved relations dramatically to the extent that when issues have arisen in the last decade, they don't cause the same pain that they used to. It didn't take much for Australia and Indonesia to push each other apart and say, well, look in an untrusting way at each other. I think the last time that occurred was when there were allegations that Australia had spied on the President of Indonesia's wife for the telephone or something.
There are a few unpleasant consular cases.
Yeah. But look, it's fair to say that in the years since that incident, Australia and Indonesia have worked together in common cause about a range of things. There was lots of cooperation in the wake of the Boxing Day tsunami. There was lots of cooperation with respect to Indonesia's efforts to tamp down on IUU fishing, because Indonesia had never taken illegal fishing seriously until Minister Susi became the minister, and then suddenly she was all for it, and she found in Australia a willing partner to help her shore up the southern flank, so to speak, to do that. And so today, Australia and Indonesia are probably as close as they have ever been. And when issues have arisen, so for example, there were some issues with respect to the export of live cattle from Australia to Indonesia. Now in the past, that kind of incident would have caused relations to sink. It had no effect, none whatsoever. The two countries said, right, we're going to work this out, we're going to sort these arrangements out, and they did. So I think the boundary arrangements have played a role in that. By no means the only role, but the two countries now, their relations are robust, and that when an incident occurs between them now, it is resolved, and it is resolved quickly without angst or unpleasantness or all the usual things that used to happen when I was a young man and Australia and Indonesia would butt heads occasionally. That doesn't happen anymore, and it's quite delightful that it doesn't, because the two countries, I think, have never been closer, and it's quite wonderful, actually, just how well Australia and Indonesia get on these days, to the extent that now we can have a security treaty and nobody bats an eyelid, whereas 30 years ago that was just impossible. It's inconceivable that that would ever happen. 30 years ago, Australia and Indonesia were severing defence ties, and I remember this because ANCORS runs a program as part of Australia's defence cooperation with Indonesia. We teach in the Indonesian Naval Staff College, and the Commandant of the Staff College wrote to the President of Indonesia in 1999 and said, can we please keep this going because we really value it. And so for 3 years we were the only defence cooperation activity between Australia and Indonesia for 3 whole years. And then when the spying allegations occurred, the same thing happened. And again, the head of the Commandant of the College wrote to the President's office, and we still got an exemption. So we've had 30 years of uninterrupted defence cooperation between Australia and Indonesia, but part of that is only the ANCORS program continuing. Now, it's inconceivable that we would be the only program left because the cooperation is so strong and so wide-ranging, and it's quite fantastic. So it is possible to come from a point of difference to a point of strength, where the relationship is strong enough to be able to do this. And I've seen it in my lifetime, and as I say, I think it's quite wonderful. Because Australia and Indonesia can do much good in the region working together, and do a lot of good working together.
Thank you, Professor. I have one more question. Thanks that you have good neighbors. According to the UNCLOS, we also have the one quite famous principle that the maritime zone for the archipelagos, which means that Indonesia is one of the archipelagos.
Yeah.
So, did you find any difficult to discuss the coastal limitations and archipelago geographical maritime should be different? So, how Australia discussed with Indonesia this problem?
Look, Indonesia was one of the originators of the archipelagic concept, and the provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention were specifically designed so Indonesia would be an archipelago.
I see.
Have you ever wondered how they came up with the lengths for the archipelagic baselines and the land-to-water ratio? Indonesia, and I think you're allowed 3% of the baselines are allowed to be over 100 nautical miles to a maximum of 125.
Yeah.
The 3% is to accommodate Indonesia because it has three baselines that are over 100 nautical miles, and so they represented 3% of the total, and that was how that was arrived at. The maximum distance for 125 was for the benefit of the Philippines.
Right.
Their longest single baseline is 123.9 nautical miles across the Gulf of Morocco. And the land-to-water ratio, in its original archipelagic configuration, Indonesia's land-to-water ratio was 1 part land to 1.03 parts water. So the 1-to-1 ratio was specifically to ensure that Indonesia would qualify.
Right.
Now, Indonesia has enclosed more water since in the Natuna Sea and elsewhere.
You refer to the islands?
Pardon? No, the amount of water that was enclosed.
Oh, yeah.
So the original configuration of Indonesia between Sumatra and Borneo used to leave a big hole,
right,
where the EEZ would come down, and then Indonesia cut the hole across and turned it into archipelagic waters. That's increased their land-to-water ratio a little more, but they were always qualified because it was designed for them to qualify. Once there had been an agreement during the negotiation of the convention with respect to archipelagic sea lanes passage, Australia has been consistently supportive of the convention, including the provisions dealing with archipelagic states. So Australia does not have a problem with Indonesia being an archipelagic state. It recognises that Indonesia is an archipelagic state, and Australia has provided technical advice to other archipelagic states to help them draw their archipelagic baselines, which would be a bit cheeky if we didn't support the archipelagic concept. So Australia has assisted the Solomon Islands, for example, in drawing archipelagic baselines, and Papua New Guinea for drawing archipelagic baselines, both of which are reasonably proximate to Australia. So Australia, as far as I'm aware, has no problem with Indonesia being an archipelagic state. Delimiting boundaries with archipelagic states and what use you make of archipelagic baselines, well, this is probably a problem Cambodia doesn't need to worry about. If you don't have any archipelagos near
Thank you for your explanation. I really like your explanation very well. Last but not least, I have one sentence that I like from your explanation. You said that good boundary require consultation from the party. Sorry if I quote your message wrong. Yes, I really like this sentence very much. It creates the friendly atmosphere between the whole party or the negotiator, yes. And last, from the news maybe you heard that there's no progress from the implementation of the MOU 2001 regarding the overlap land area between Cambodia and Thailand. It is from Cambodian side, I think it is not absolutely true. As you observe, in Thailand, there were many political instability also. In 2006 and 2014, there were the coup d'etat at that time. And how can we negotiate with each other about the MOU 2001?
Yeah. Look, I can appreciate it makes it very difficult when the other side lacks stability because of domestic circumstances, and it means finding someone who can give guarantees and speak in a consistent fashion can be challenging. The only hope is to try to draw out an agreement when opportunities provide, and then to maintain that steadfastly. So if instability occurs, at least it's still clear as to what the arrangements are and how they're to subsist, which is why the conclusion of a permanent boundary would have some appeal. Temporary arrangements can be useful at de-escalating tension, but they rarely lead to permanent solutions. So, for example, China and Japan and China and the Republic of Korea have long had temporary arrangements of a practical nature to try to keep their fishing fleets apart and to stop enforcement in overlapping areas which could lead to escalation. That has enjoyed some success between Japan and China, but it's fair to say it's been mixed success between the Republic of Korea and China. So these things can be useful in de-escalation, but they're not permanent solutions, and they shouldn't be seen as permanent solutions. So to that extent, it's one of the reasons I commend what the Cambodian government has done, initiating the conciliation, because that's indicating you would like a solution which is robust and is permanent, rather than something which is temporary and might be washed away or lost when there's times of instability perhaps on the other side.
Professor, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your valuable experience and insight with us today. And your time, your word today is provide us with a clear understanding of the compulsory conciliation process under UNCLOS. The knowledge you are sharing today will undoubtedly assist us in better understanding the opportunity and challenge that may arise throughout the proceeding, your term, yes. On behalf of my colleague, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you and your team for this enriching discussion. We hope to remain in touch and look forward to further opportunity for the cooperation and exchange. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Professor, can we take one photo together?